The rain had started in the late afternoon, soft and hesitant at first, then rising with confidence until the Lagos Debistu Judoto Wating. Streets glistened beneath a curtain of silver. Traffic clotted the roads in Ikoyi, horns blaring, engines idling, and drivers barking at hawkers darting between bumpers. Inside a black Bentley with windows tinted dark enough to hide its owner's soul, Daniel Westwood sat silently, watching the outside world blur into streaks of rain and neon. He wasn't supposed to be there, at least not in that part of town. The meeting he had attended earlier had ended hours ago, and his driver, Joshua, kept glancing into the rearview mirror. Waiting for instructions that never came, Daniel said nothing, only gestured for him to keep circling. The city's chaos was strangely comforting, better than the stillness of home, better than the silence of Victoria's cold stares and conversations that ended before they began. As they turned onto a narrow lane near Queen's Drive, something made him lean forward. At the edge of a crumbling colonial house, a figure stood in the rain, arms outstretched like she was embracing the sky. A woman, barefoot, wild-haired, soaked to the bone, twirled slowly on the broken pavement, as if performing for a silent crowd only she could see. Her laughter, though faint behind the glass, sounded too pure for madness and too broken for joy. Daniel stared. She wore what might have once been a floral dress, now shredded and clinging to her skin. Her hair, thick and matted, framed her face like a curtain of grief. Some passers-by gave her a wide berth, others pointed and chuckled. Children whispered the word crazy before tossing pebbles her way and sprinting off into the rain. But Daniel's gaze didn't move. He felt something in his chest, an ache he hadn't known in years. Not attraction, not pity, recognition. He returned the next day, told his assistant he had back-to-back site visits, cleared his schedule, drove himself, parked on the same street, watched the same woman from behind the safety of his windscreen. She didn't dance that day. She sat on the porch of the house, drawing in the mud with her fingers, her head tilted occasionally toward the sky, as if listening for a sound only she could hear. He returned again the next day, and the next. He didn't know why he kept coming, only that something inside him was unraveling, something that had been neatly coiled under designer suits and five-star meetings. The woman wasn't just a stranger on the street. She was a question his heart had been too afraid to ask. On the 12th day, he stepped out of the car. The rain had stopped, and the street steamed beneath the afternoon heat. She was seated again, her bare feet muddy, her dress no cleaner than it had been a week ago. He walked slowly, careful not to startle her. She looked up. For a moment, the haze in her eyes cleared, brown, deep, familiar. Then she spoke. "Daniel?" His legs nearly gave way. How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She blinked. Her gaze dropped to her fingers, now tracing invisible circles on the concrete. She began to hum, a melody so familiar it sent shivers down his spine. He knew that tune. It was a lullaby his mother used to hum when he was sick. But it wasn't hers originally. It had been taught to him by someone else, by Emily Grace. He staggered back, heart thudding. Could it be? Could this woman, this wild, broken version of the girl he once loved, be her? Emily had vanished when they were 17. One day, she was laughing under the mango tree behind his family's compound in Surulere. The next, she was gone. No explanations. No goodbye. Her mother, their housekeeper, had died shortly after, and no one ever spoke of her again. Until now. He returned to his car, soaked in sweat despite the cool breeze, and stared at the street ahead like it held all the answers. That night he dug through old albums, photo folders, even his late father's journals. There she was, Emily, smiling, wearing that same floral dress before it had turned to tatters. He remembered how she used to tuck her curls behind her ears when she was nervous, how she bit her lip before she laughed. He remembered the paper boats they made together, and how she once told him that the world had no space for girls like her unless someone made room. He remembered promising to make that room. The next day, he brought food. A paper bag with rice and dodo from the best buka in Lekki. She didn't look at him when he offered it, but she took the bag, sat with it on her lap like a fragile thing. He started coming every morning. Sometimes she ignored him, sometimes she sang, sometimes she looked at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through his skin. Every once in a while, she'd say something that made no sense until it did. "You used to climb the mango tree, but you were always scared of the bees. I told you the stars would fall one day. You promised you'd come back. You didn't." Each phrase hit like a sledgehammer to his chest. Eventually, he couldn't bear to leave her outside. Not after what she'd been through. He arranged for a small serviced apartment in Ikoyi, clean, quiet, filled with light. A nurse who had experience with trauma care, a therapist who didn't ask too many questions. It took time, weeks, but she agreed to go. He didn't tell Victoria. He couldn't. His wife had grown cold years ago. Beautiful, sharp, calculated, but emotionally absent. Their marriage had become a polite arrangement bound by mutual appearances and shared custody of their public image. Telling her he was spending thousands to care for a mentally ill woman from the street, who may or may not be his first love, would only lead to one conclusion. He visited Emily daily. At first she barely spoke, curled up on the couch, hummed to herself, slept. Then one day she asked for a sketch pad. He brought one, along with colored pencils. The next day she drew. By the end of the week, there were flowers taped to the walls, faces, a small house with a tree. He brought her books, her favorite music. Slowly, Emily began to re-emerge. Hesitant, quiet, unsure, but there. Then came the night he stayed too long. They had been talking about childhood, mangoes, Sunday rice, a boy she once liked. "You were that boy," she said, eyes clear. "I know," he whispered. When she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. When she kissed him, he didn't stop her. When he woke up the next morning beside her on the couch, her head on his chest and sunlight pouring into the room, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The guilt came later. Weeks passed. Then the nurse pulled him aside. "She's pregnant," she said. He stood still. The air in the room thickened. He turned slowly to the door inside which Emily sat, humming as she sketched a little girl with curly hair and a soft smile. A child, his child. He wanted to run. He wanted to fall to his knees. He wanted to disappear. But he didn't. He walked in, sat beside her, and took her hand. And she looked at him and said, "I think her name is Hope." He didn't tell anyone about the pregnancy. Not his assistant, not his friends, not even Joshua, his driver who had been with him for nearly a decade, and knew when something wasn't right. Daniel existed in a strange in-between now, half of his life, wrapped in tailored suits, boardrooms and gala invitations. The other half grounded in that quiet, Igoi apartment where a woman the world had discarded was sketching a life that was slowly returning to her. Emily talked more now, still fragile, still uncertain, but no longer drifting in and out of the clouds. Someday she would dance, not the kind of chaotic spinning he had first seen, but soft movements, barefoot in the living room, swaying to an old high-life tune he brought in on a CD. She'd close her eyes and move like she was remembering. A life stolen from her. He bought her more sketch pads. She filled everyone, sometimes with people, sometimes with places. But one recurring image appeared, again and again. A boy standing beneath a mango tree, holding out a paper boat. "I draw it every time I feel like I'm going to disappear," she said once. "Because he reminds me to stay." He knew that boy was him. In Banana Island, Victoria had begun to ask questions. At first, she attributed his distance to work stress. But Daniel had grown even quieter than usual, distracted, absent. She saw the signs, the long calls, the sudden silence when she entered the room, the way his phone never left his hand, the way he smiled when no one else was talking. She went through his study one night and found the clinic's envelope, the apartment lease, the ultrasound photo tucked into the back of a drawer. When Daniel walked in, she was already standing in the center of the room, shaking. "What the hell is this?" she asked, her voice cold and sharp. He stood still, saying nothing. "You're cheating on me?" Her voice cracked. "It's not like that," he said softly. "Don't insult me, Daniel. You think I don't know when I've been replaced? He wanted to explain, but there was no way to say it without it sounding worse. Who is she? Victoria demanded. Emily, he said. Her name is Emily. She stared at him, blinking. Emily Grace? He nodded. That girl from your childhood? She asked. That girl who vanished? She didn't vanish. She was taken. She's been on the streets. I found her. I helped her. And now pregnant. Victoria finished, her voice rising. Daniel looked down. I can't believe you would risk everything for someone you barely know anymore, she said. I knew her before I knew anything else. She's not just someone from the past. She's the only person who ever really saw me before the world told me who I had to be. Victoria turned away, breathing hard. You know this will destroy everything, right? Your reputation, your career, our children. I didn't plan any of this, he said. But you let it happen. She looked at him then, something in her eyes breaking. I gave you 20 years, Daniel, and you throw it away for a ghost. He didn't respond. What could he say? The silence between them was louder than any scream. She left that night, taking the children with her to her parents' estate in London. Daniel watched them drive off from the upstairs window and stood there long after their taillights had vanished. Back in Ikoyi, Emily could sense something had changed. He looked more tired now, worn down, but never once did she see regret in his eyes when he looked at her. She touched his hand gently one night as they sat in silence. I didn't mean to cause all this, she said. You didn't, he whispered. You saved me. As Emily's mind healed, her memories returned. She told Daniel about the night she was taken, how, after her mother died, a distant relative took her in and sold her to traffickers. She was taken out of the city, moved from house to house. She was sent to Port Harcourt, abused for years, then made her way back to Lagos. She escaped after 5 years, wandered for months, then years, surviving on scraps and sleeping in shelters. Her mind splintered from trauma. She had wandered the streets of Yaba, then Ikeja, then Ikoyi, searching, waiting for something that felt like home. I never forgot you, she said. Even when I forgot my name. Daniel wept. She returned to Lagos because somehow her soul remembered the place where Daniel once made her feel safe. I thought you forgot me, she said. I never did, he replied. You were the one good thing I had before the world told me who I had to be. They named the baby Hope. Daniel bought baby clothes and furniture and filled the apartment with softness, blankets, curtains, books. He wanted this place to feel like a home. Even if the world outside was starting to call him a fool, the media didn't take long to catch on. It started with whispers in the business circles, then the gossip blogs. Billionaire abandons family for woman from the streets. Oh, Westwood scandal. The truth about Emily Grace. Reporters camped outside his old office. Board members called for his resignation. Clients pulled out of projects. He stepped down voluntarily. He gave up his chairmanship, sold off major shares, and liquidated his overseas accounts. People thought he had lost his mind. But Daniel had never felt clearer. He used part of the money to purchase the crumbling colonial building where he first saw Emily. He hired architects and therapists and social workers. He called it the Grace Foundation, a sanctuary for women like Emily, women with broken pasts and quiet strength, forgotten by society and buried under trauma. Emily, meanwhile, bloomed. The pregnancy gave her focus. Her artwork became vibrant, stories in color, emotions in every brushstroke. She painted while hope kicked inside her. One day, she painted a picture of herself holding a little girl under the rain. Behind them stood a man with an umbrella, reaching toward them. She titled it Found. When Hope was born, it was raining. Daniel held her in his arms, this tiny thing with soft brown eyes and a quiet grip, and felt the kind of love that required no explanation. Emily named her after the thing she thought she'd lost forever, hope. They moved into a smaller home in Ikoyi. Daniel refused to return to Banana Island. I built skyscrapers, he said, but this is the first time I'm building a life. He rarely saw Victoria. Their divorce was quiet but final. She took the children. Daniel shared custody, but remained in Nigeria. He didn't fight. He didn't protest. Some things couldn't be forced to stay. Emily and Hope became his world. Hope grew quickly, sharp, funny, stubborn like her mother. She loved to draw, loved mangoes, and always asked for one more story before bed. Emily would sing her lullabies, real ones now, the old ones. She never danced in the rain again. Now she danced in sunlight, holding Hope's hands and spinning through the garden. And Daniel, watching from the porch, felt like the richest man in the world. Hope had her mother's eyes, deep, expressive, full of curiosity. From the time she could walk, she wandered with purpose, as if the world owed her more than sidewalks and toy boxes. She was the kind of child who asked big questions with small words and rarely accepted silence as an answer. When she laughed, it filled the room with something more powerful than music, something like healing. Daniel watched her grow in awe. He had built cities, managed empires, negotiated billion-naira deals in glass towers above the clouds. But nothing had ever made him feel so entirely needed, so perfectly present as holding his daughter while she slept. Emily was different now, not completely. Some scars never faded, but her darkness had loosened its grip. The fog in her mind had lifted enough for sunlight to get in. She smiled without looking over her shoulder. She painted every day. She danced again, sometimes in the rain, but not as someone lost in a storm, rather as someone celebrating it had passed. Their new home in Ikoyi was smaller, warmer. There were no marble pillars or imported chandeliers, just white walls, soft lighting, and plants Emily cared for like children. Her art was everywhere, on the walls, on the floors, hanging in markets and art cafes all across. Lagos, a gallery in Lekki, offered her a solo exhibition. She declined. "I just want women like me to know they can heal," she said. "That's the only audience I need." The Grace Foundation opened officially on a cloudy Saturday. It occupied the colonial building where Daniel had first seen her dancing alone. He had restored it, not to its original grandeur, but to something softer, realer. The compound held counseling rooms, a small shelter, a training space for women to learn to paint. So garden and breathe. At the entrance was a sculpture, two hands holding a paper boat. On opening day, women came in shyly, eyes cautious. Some had bruises they didn't explain. Some carried silence like a second skin. Others clung to children and stories, too heavy for their tongues. Emily sat among them, not as their founder, but as one of them. She shared tea, offered crayons to their children, and never once introduced herself as anything other than Emily. Daniel watched her from the corner of the courtyard. She hadn't just healed, she had become something greater. "I used to think I needed to save her," he told a volunteer. "Turns out she was the one saving me." Daniel no longer wore suits. He traded his tailored wardrobe for cotton shirts and rolled-up sleeves. He managed the foundation quietly, letting Emily take the light whenever she wanted it and shielding her when she didn't. Hope was 10 when she stood on a small wooden stage at the Grace Foundation's 5th-year anniversary. Dressed in a pale yellow dress with her curly hair in 2 puffs, she looked out at a crowd filled with women who had once walked through hell and now sat beside each other in peace. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone, but her voice rang clear across the courtyard. "My mommy once forgot how to speak, and my daddy gave up the world to help her remember." The room was silent. Emily pressed a hand to her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks as Daniel reached for her hand. Hope smiled. "That's why they called me Hope," she added, "because I came after the storm." The audience rose in applause, some standing, some wiping tears. Hope ran into her mother's arms, and Emily lifted her up and spun her around as if the weight of every broken year had finally lifted. Later that evening, as golden light settled across the trees, Daniel and Emily stood beneath the old mango tree in Surulere, the place where it all began. It was no longer the backyard of a rich boy's home, or the hiding place of a young housekeeper's daughter. It was sacred ground now. They had invited no guests, no press, no flowers. Just them, just love. Emily wore a simple cream gown and no shoes. Daniel wore linen and carried a folded piece of paper in his chest pocket, a drawing from Hope, with "Don't forget to kiss" scribbled in the corner. A local minister whispered the vows. They didn't need to be reminded what love meant. They had already lived it. "I've waited my whole life to come back to you," he said. "I never left," she replied. When he kissed her, the breeze picked up slightly, as if the trees themselves were exhaling in relief. Years later, people still came to the Grace Foundation to ask about the woman who danced in the rain, and the man who chose her. They came to see the painting hung in the hallway, 3 figures under a mango tree. A woman, a man, and a little girl with arms stretched toward the sky. The plaque beneath it read, "The broken star rises." And in that story, many found their own beginning. Sometimes life breaks us in places no one can see. But healing isn't always loud or quick. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments, the people who stay, the child who smiles, the heart that chooses love again. We may not get to rewrite the past, but we can always reclaim our future. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on notifications for more stories. Thank you for tuning in.